See You on the Other Side podcast live. How's everybody doing on a Sunday afternoon? Today, we're excited to be joined by someone who's been on the podcast a few times before, and he's got a brand new book coming out on June 16th, and that is Punk Rock and UFOs, Stranger Than Fiction. Aims to normalize the paranormal through current pop culture, mythology, fiction, and its connection to unexplained phenomena. The book features insights and exclusive interviews from the world of academia, journalism, television, and film, pop culture, science, and UFO studies like Tom DeLonge, Leslie Kean, Kevin Day, Sean Cahill, Jeffrey Kriepel, Peter Levenda, Rick Strassman, David Marquez from DC Comics, Diana Pasulka, and others. So joining Wendy and I today in the See You on the Other Side live stream is Mr. Mike Damante. How you doing today, Mike?
Good. Thank you guys for having me back. I think the second podcast I ever did was you guys. So
hey,
appreciate
right.
it.
Well, we're happy that you like us enough to show up again.
Yeah,
for sure.
happy to have you as a return character.
Yes. So, Mike, what I guess because your first one was like from from anarchy to cryptozoology, or was the name of the first one, and then the next one was True Believers. What inspired Stranger Than Fiction? What was your inspiration behind the name?
On the title, the title "Stranger Than Fiction" was in the previous book. It was one of the chapters, and that was the chapter that was kind of delving into kind of mythology and some events that sound stranger than fiction. And obviously there's a Bad Religion song of the same name. I grew up being a Bad Religion fan. I got Bad Religion tattoos.
Oh, even better. Awesome.
I've interviewed those guys before. I was always a big fan of them. And so I guess that's another little nod for the punk rock aspect of Punk Rock and UFOs, is to name it Stranger Than Fiction. And I mean, the title fits perfect because everything, I'm trying to do in the book, I'm trying to normalize this idea of weird or paranormal or unexplained. And, these events truly are stranger than fiction. Like some of these real life events, you think, how could this be, who can make this up if they tried,
So, you're going into it. So now, I mean, this is your third book on it, and you've been blogging about this for several years and into it. As you're getting into it, how do you think that from your first book, when you started thinking about this and started blogging about it, to now your third, where it's like, okay, you've been doing it for a while, you're part of the scene. What about your style or belief system has changed in this time, that you've gone from just getting into it to now? I mean, and a band by their third album, they pretty much they figured out what they've done. You know what I mean? So
Get the workflow down at least.
Yeah. So as you're into your third album here, what has changed or most about your belief system or the way you approach things?
That's a great question. I look at it, multiple ways. So if you think about kind of not just bands, but all forms of medium, and media, you kind of learn as you go. I think like a band's just finding their sound on their first couple of albums, and they have that one defining album where they put it all together. Or same thing with movies, like a trilogy. Every good trilogy ends on like a really good note. Or attempts to. And I look at these set of books almost now.
Right, we all saw the last Star Wars.
Yeah. So I kind of refer to it in my mind as a trilogy because I was recording. Who was I with the other day? I was recording with Ryan Sprague and Somewhere in the Skies, and one of the things I said on his podcast was, if this is my last book I write about the subject of UFOs, it's a good one to go out on. Not saying that will be as well, but I really feel like I built on the first two books where it's like, just read this one instead, because it builds upon that and does so much more. But like in terms of belief systems, I mean, it's in terms of, it goes beyond just, UFOs and paranormal. I think your belief system, you're open to more stuff the more you read and the more you learn. Most UFO researchers, when they first get into it, they want the nuts and bolts and the science and the data. And then you realize sometimes that's hard to come about. And sometimes our traditional scientific methods really can't be used to study some of these paranormal aspects and elements. So absolutely, I definitely opened my mind to more of like the new age stuff, more of the consciousness. And I think that's where the field of ufology is going anyway. So Yeah, definitely. I kind of went away a little bit from the nuts and bolts aspects to opening up my mind to saying, well, you know what, this is possible too, and this being, some of the, consciousness and weirder aspects.
It's like the stuff that's harder to talk to people not so into it about.
Yeah. Well, it's
because of
funny. It's funny you say that, Wendy, because so I teach, and last was in the spring we did a day of professional development where we taught our other teachers anything we wanted. So I did a kind of a all things weird, and I hit him with everything. I probably shouldn't. I hit him with Skinwalker Ranch. I hit him with goblins. I hit him with all the weird stuff. It wasn't just UFOs, and they were just like, a lot of them are open to it, but there's people looking at me like.
Well,
I can imagine.
I mean, the high strangeness stuff, though, is where it's kind of. So think about it when you think about Bigfoot. Like, you can walk in and talk about Bigfoot, and you're like, okay, well, Bigfoot is an undiscovered hominid kind of thing. And that seems reasonable to most people. Like, oh, yeah, there could be species that are undiscovered. There's just a gigantic ape roaming around the Northwest somewhere that we can't figure it out. Or you go to aliens. It's a big universe, right? And you're like, well, of course, if it's really that big of a universe, can we be the only planet that there is any kind of life form? So yes, all right, I give you aliens. And then you start getting into things that are like, well, what if Bigfoot's an alien, guys? And then and that's when some people stay with you, and some people are like, hold on a sec.
Right. But it is like a gradual thing. I feel like our progression into the paranormal scene, you slowly, first you learn like, okay, this connects, like, okay, maybe the Bigfoot thing, it's an interdimensional thing, or there's some other kind of thing that's not physical going on. And then you're like, okay, takes a while and a lot of reading and talking to people to sort of accept that. And then you go from there to the next step is that, like, well, maybe there's also that's somehow related to the paranormal smell that you get when you see a ghost. And, it's just, I feel like now we're so many steps away from that first step that it's easy to talk to a guy like you, Mike, who's researched it and spent a lot of time in the world too. But you got to kind of ease your way in with most people.
Well, it's weird. Like, even like the high strangeness stuff that's associated with like Bigfoot, some of the more out there theories that it's, Bigfoot has this like quantum energy to it, or it could be an alien. It's like, but the more you read into that stuff, you're like, you know what? This explains a lot. This explains why it's so hard to find, how it magically disappears. Like, it really does explain a lot, even though there's no like concrete evidence to it. It just, it just makes sense for us.
Right. Well, it was interesting because I remember a couple of years ago we were at a convention near like Fargo, North Dakota, and Nick Redfern was doing a whole presentation on the Loch Ness Monster. And he had written a book on Nessie and had done all these things. And then at the end, you can tell somebody, oh, the Loch Ness Monster, well, I think it might be real because it actually might be an undiscovered creature, or maybe a dinosaur did survive for a million years, or there's all those little things that seem like plausible. And then Nick Redfern, after all this like research and stuff, goes, well, I've come to this idea that it may be not like physical but paranormal. And then I'm like, oh my God, Nick Redfern's in on that Nessie might be like a creature from like another dimension. Cool. When I was not expecting to hear that, kind of thing, because that just seems so like reasonable people are like, yes, these things could exist, but it's not going to be somebody, it's not going to be Bigfoot crossing dimensions. But then the more you hear about it, the more those explanations make sense. And then you start thinking of the Sherlock Holmes, right? When you've eliminated everything else besides the impossible, then the impossible has to be the answer. And that's when things start getting, dicey when you're having a Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, I have that book, that Nessie book, and I remember reading, thinking the same thing. I was like, no way. But then, like, the more you read on, like, he makes a really good argument, especially the stuff with like Aleister Crowley living like on the loch and the experiments he done. And then you think about that, and you kind of think about how, some of the occult like scientists that the Germans and the Nazis used to try to conjure things, and it's like, you start putting together pieces. So it's like, all throughout time, people have tried to do these these magical conjurings for beings and stuff. So it's like it's not the first time you're hearing about it in this book. So
right, and then like, okay, then that's basically Hellboy. So now you're saying like Hellboy's real, awesome. But it is those ideas though, that maybe when you're first getting into this, you're like, okay, this is all pretty silly, and then you start thinking like, okay, but it does connect more dots than some of the other explanations. Why aren't there Bigfoot bones? Well, because he doesn't die in this dimension, guys. But yes, of course. Okay, we can go off and talk about ridiculous stuff for a little bit. But so your interviews for this new book coming out, what was, you think, your biggest get or your favorite interview that you were most excited about going in?
So a lot of the interviews I did for the book, some of them were interviews I did for articles on my website, and some of them were specifically for the book as well. Obviously, the biggest get was just a quote. I mean, that's all I asked for. That's all I begged for from To the Stars, is to get a quote from Tom DeLonge. I think which helped too is back in, when was it? It was summertime, no, September. I was able to give him my book at an Angels and Airwaves show. So he has my old book, and then they played here in Houston in December, and I saw him before the show, and I was talking to him. He said he still had my book. He kind of, read through it as well. And then also the time where I was reaching out to get the quote from the book, it was when he was doing a lot of radio and a lot of media during quarantine. So he had a lot of downtime. So the stars kind of aligned for it to happen. And, I wasn't asking for a full-on interview. I just wanted a specific quote. And it worked out perfect. So I think it really completed the book having his quote in there for sure.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about Tom DeLonge and obviously To the Stars Academy. Who would have? I mean, the guy from Blink-182. I've always enjoyed Blink-182's music. I mean, I remember sitting there in college and like playing "Damn It" on acoustic guitar and stuff like that, right? And having that like as a thing when everybody's drinking and staying up by the fire, like that was one of the songs you play because it's a great song. But the fact that the dude from Blink is now like a dominant force in the UFO.
Didn't see that coming back in the day,
But I mean, I think To the Stars Academy is a really interesting thing because. And I don't know how much you get into this in Stranger Than Fiction, because are they a mouthpiece for the Department of Defense? Are they, because the people they're working with, and then Tom DeLonge is mentioned in the Hillary emails or whatever when they came out. You're like, and I thought it would just be she's like, she's like, I'm sick of hearing Blink-182 on the radio or whatever. Like they really overplay that track.
We need to do something about this. We need some kind of a legislation.
Right. They need to play the rest of the album. And so like they're a driving force now in the conversation, but at the same time, how much of that conversation is being driven for the things that we want to hear versus, or the things that maybe powerful forces want us to hear versus the search for the truth. And like Tom DeLonge especially, because there is the celebrity, like he all of a sudden, like UFOs now have an influencer, right? Getting in, like that's, him kind
Their advocate.
Yeah, an advocate. And so I was just wondering, like in the book and in your own particular research, how much do you see of To the Stars as, do you see any of it being maybe disinformation from the government to kind of get us on this trail?
I was skeptical, I think as a lot of people were at first. I think in my second book, I kind of questioned how much of it is actually controlled. I think since, but at the same time, though, I was supportive of seeing where it's going to go. Mm-hmm. And I think for what we've seen in the past, especially in the past few months, people don't realize that they're a very small company, even though they have a lot of high-profile people. But the fact that the Pentagon came out, admitted that, hey, yes, these are our videos, they're real. A lot of people say that's the quote-unquote disclosure. that they were, teasing to. And if that's a win, absolutely, for sure. But you also saw on the other hand of that, for years people have been questioning if Lou Elizondo is who he says he was, or did he really work for this program? And there's just been so many articles just beating that to death. And yes, he is who he says he is. It's been proven. But yeah, there's even more kind of blurring the lines with the two, with the Pentagon spokeswoman has been sending missed messages too. And these are things that Lou Elizondo warned about years ago. He said, look, there are some people who aren't going to be happy with what I'm doing, and they may try to, I'm not saying sabotage it, but, they may try to, blur the lines a little bit. And that's what we're seeing now. The Pentagon has really had mixed messaging with this stuff, with some of their statements that they've released, and really just kind of changing their tune on stuff. But the Pentagon spokeswoman, Susan Gao, if you even research her, it's really fascinating, because basically her resume says, PSYOP is one of the things she has expertise in, and also controlling messaging. So if the messaging is to make the UFO community and people kind of question and argue if as Lou Elizondo says he is, I think they did a pretty good job on that, because there's still quite a few people in the community who don't buy it, even though, I think a lot of us know better that, yes, he is who he says he is.
Well, okay, and there you lead to a couple things right there. Like, number one, she has like PSYOP in the resume.
Yeah.
Controlling messaging in the resume. And don't worry, guys, I'm the spokesperson. And so, right, like, maybe don't put PSYOPs on your LinkedIn. But that kind of thing, though. So when the Pentagon came out, it was during the pandemic. So it was during when the news cycle was very different than during a normal news cycle. Like, when you think about the first time that this footage gets released in December of 2017, you have the New York Times come out and say that, hey guys, just in case you were wondering, UFOs are real, and here's the stuff we've seen. Here's the Nimitz footage. Here's the Tic Tac. Here's the whole thing. Merry Christmas. Bye. And now it's like, oh, there's a pandemic. And the stuff that, before that we disavowed or whatever, no, that's real footage, and it's from us. And everybody have a good day. Space Force.
Yeah. Well, it backfired on them. Think about it. They released it during the pandemic, thinking the story was going to be buried, but it wasn't. It was actually one of the highest clicked stories for a lot of the major sites. Ralph Blumenthal at the New York Times, he's someone I keep in touch with, and he says all the stories they do on that stuff is always the most read and most commented stories of the day. But yeah, like all the major media outlets picked up on that story that day in the middle of the pandemic. So I really think they strategically released it during that week, thinking it was going to be buried, and it didn't happen.
And so, right, because everybody was still interested in talking about it, because everybody was at home with nothing to do. I have a 3-year-old, so I always had something to do.
But people who don't normally watch the news might also have the news on because they want to know what's going on with everything else. And then it's like, wait, hold on. This isn't the same pandemic story repeated over and over again. Wait. This one's actually interesting.
There's some kind of plague, and UFOs are real. What? Right? Did we enter Bizarro world and nobody told us about it? So obviously it's great to get to the stars and get time to launch to say something, and it's awesome. The fact, I was really excited. I remember one time, 20-some years ago, when I did an interview with Ronnie James Dio, and then I went to a Dio concert. And he's like, oh, remember that was a great interview, and you're in a band, right? I'm like, yeah, and I brought you our new song that it's like a metal song you might like. And he's like, thank you so much. We're going to crank this up in the tour bus.
Aw, so polite.
Right, and that made my week, right? To think that idea that of course, you think Dio, he's going to be like, I want to listen to this asshole song. But then the fact that you gave him a book, and he's like, oh yeah, I've held on to your book. It's something that I want to get to. And that's a cool thing. And that can that's an awesome thing to think that hopefully some of the messages and stuff you said might filter down eventually into the kind of decisions that are being made by the people at To the Stars. For your new, in Stranger Than Fiction, if you said if that was your favorite get, what was maybe your most surprising interview? Maybe something that you didn't, you're like, oh, let's do this interview. Let's see what happens. And then it led to maybe a revelation for you, or it ended up being more juicy than you thought it was going to be?
That's a great question. So right when you said that, I had to think about it, but I got it right away. So Travis Taylor was one of the lead scientists on the History Channel show Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, and I participated in like a roundtable teleconference interview with him. And I did a story on my website, and I used some of the quotes I used in the story, and also some of the other quotes I didn't use in the story for the book. And it's really fascinating because a couple of things I learned, with all the great things he does with the Department of Defense and with NASA in the past, he's also a science fiction writer too. So for him, like, even though he was skeptical going in, he was still, open-minded because he had this sci-fi past to him too. And he just made some really good points that I didn't even think of when talking about Skinwalker Ranch and the way it's shaped. And it's almost shaped like a crater if like an asteroid hit it. So like little things like that he said in the interview that I put in the book really just kind of had my mind going like, oh, wow, this is kind of like some of the things that I'm theorizing in the book as well. So it really kind of fit together.
And, for those out there who might not be as familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, we've never done a show about it. And I'm not even that familiar except for James,
Jeremy Corbell.
Jeremy Corbell's documentary about it. So, Wendy, you've been watching The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, though, haven't you?
Yeah, just started. So we're fairly early in the series.
Okay,
but
so can you do a quick one? Can you do a quick 101 about the Skinwalker Ranch?
Me? Or
yeah,
are you
just from watching the show. Like, what's the show about?
Oh, yeah, it's an area, I guess it's kind of in the desert. But it's an area of high strangeness where just they've had all kinds of incidents occur, and it has a ton of Native American folklore associated with it. But so far, it's like a cornucopia of seeing lights in the sky, finding dead animals, people getting cursed for digging on the land, just all kinds of, you name it. Mike, you could probably do a better job of summarizing just because it's fairly new to me, but
I think you hit the nail on the head. I always say it's a plethora of paranormal. It's like the best of
perfect.
The best of all in one place. Like it's
and so it's just like a magnet for people like us, curious about these things to go and try to explore. But then there's because of the lore and the rumored dangers of messing with that sacred land and whatnot, that adds to the drama, which makes for a great reality show.
Well, what I think is interesting about it and the idea is that because what I have heard about skinwalkers is it's the idea that they're like Native American magicians, right? And that's part of the lore of the werewolf. And the lore of the werewolf is that the original idea wasn't that you just turned into a wolf like we think of. It's that these people would wear the skin of a wolf, and then they would turn into something that was both man and wolf, and something supernatural and something greater than that. And that's even in the European tradition of werewolves. And now we go to the Native American tradition of werewolves and the skinwalkers. It's even on different parts of the planet, you have this idea that when you put on the skin of an animal, you can become the animal and become something bigger and scarier and everything. So this Native American idea, the skinwalker and the folklore of the area. And so this is in Utah, right? It's in, and so that idea that you have the traditional indigenous people have this, like these scary magicians who do evil things, because the skinwalkers weren't normally like, oh yeah, you're turning into a wolf. That's awesome. The Great Spirit loves that. It's more like that these guys are doing evil things, and like the werewolves in Europe that we think of. And now, like you combine that folklore with the lights in the sky, with the high strangeness, and this is where we go to. So, Mike, like you were saying, the stranger than fiction, like we have these, predisposed notions coming into it, right? of like, okay, well, I believe in Bigfoot because Bigfoot could just be a hominid. Oh, well, now I might have to believe in interdimensional beings. And now it might be pulling from folklore and pulling from ufology and pulling everything together into something. And so that's what's interesting about the Skinwalker Ranch. But what's also interesting is that it's not, I mean, it's like a rich guy bought it too, right? Like it's the same guy who was an investor into the stars, right? Was an owner.
Yeah.
Robert Bigelow had no part of it.
Robert Bigelow used to own it, but he didn't invest into the stars. He sold it to a guy named Brandon Fugel, who's the current owner. But Bigelow obviously had Bigelow Aerospace and NIDS, which did the first investigation on it, which is what the book's about. The book, The Hunt for Skinwalker, and also the documentary was kind of about what Bigelow did. And the show is just a new batch of scientists and investigators under the new ownership.
Okay.
I guess that's the best way to describe the differences.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and that's because I haven't seen the new show yet or anything like that, so that's why I'm interested. And to me, because Robert Bigelow is because he was involved in, I thought, getting some of those like the Tic Tac footage and stuff like that. I thought he was.
Yeah.
Okay, but I could be misinformed, which is why we talk to people who are informed on this show and then talk about it. Because, you think that there's this club, right? If you believe in the Illuminati, which you never know who's going to believe in the Illuminati. But this idea of, obviously, David, we used to call him David Icky on the show before we knew you're supposed to pronounce it David Icke. That's what happens when you read.
That's embarrassing.
Even my wife, until she was 20, she said "whores divorce," and she'll admit that. She's like, "I just read it in a book. I just thought, and I'm like, I'm with you." But so like David Icky, as we call him, like you think that there's a club, and if you can get in the Lizard Club by being a billionaire, they're going to give you the secrets. They're going to tell, okay, you're a billionaire now. So Bill Gates is going to come out and he's going to vaccine the truth right into you. And Robert Bigelow is a guy that made all the money, and he is just as interested in the truth as we are, coming from, I don't know about you, Mike, but we're not billionaires over here. So like, you just think if there was an Illuminati, you think that Robert Bigelow would be in the club, right?
He's in the rich eccentric guy club. So you put him in there with Tony Stark, Bruce Wayne,
Elon Musk.
Yeah. So it's
speaking of Bruce Wayne, though, like obviously, pop culture is important. So David Marquez from DC Comics. So how did you bring in a comic book aspect to a book that's about real life paranormal? Like, where did the comic books part come in?
So one of the things I want to do is to connect current real life paranormal and UFO events to past events in history and mythology, religious texts, and how they also reflect in our popular culture. We see them in our science fiction, we see them in movies, we see them in comic books. And one of the things I kind of mentioned in my previous book, how in some cases, like our comic books are kind of like our modern day pop mythology in a sense. And this book kind of dives into that a lot deeper. David Marquez is he's part of the creative team on Marvel before going to DC, and I actually went to high school with him, so that's how I know him.
Awesome.
And he was doing at the time the Batman vs Superman comic, where the idea behind it was Batman and Superman are trying to stop the spread of the Joker who laughs. So it's basically creating these evil versions of superheroes. And I tied that with the idea that, in religious texts and mythologies, we have these stories of not evil, but, bad gods and bad deities. So he definitely helped kind of with that aspect of making sense of that. But a lot of what I'm doing is in that expertise of the book, bringing in like comic book culture and pop culture is like, these all come from some events. For the kid who watches Stranger Things, and they find out that Montauk was a real place, and they may want to go investigate that. Or, somebody who watches Harry Potter or Sabrina the Teenage Witch may say, oh, people actually really try to do magic and witchcraft. And, or, people who like the Avengers movie and, they go read about Thor and they realize that Thor is this God that lives on in so many different mythologies in Eastern Europe, and even to this day, there's still statues of him. So one of the points I make that is, what if these gods really existed, and what if they live on nowadays through our pop culture?
That's very Gaiman-esque, right? that idea. But representing that, if you guys have ever read Grant Morrison's Invisibles, like that is, like you're saying, the idea of magic and introducing Grant Morrison has this introduces chaos magic into comics with the Invisibles, and this was in the 90s when it was like the internet was different. You couldn't just look up, like there wasn't a chaos magic like webinar you could go see, and so you'd see these kind of things.
It was more limited.
Yeah, I mean there definitely was plenty of weird stuff on the internet because I was there, and one of the weird people.
You found every last bit of it.
Yes, and we were still. We were putting music up on Real Player in 1996, but. The thing is, I love the idea of also using pop culture as the lens of how we view some of these things, because I feel like pop culture is an introduction for a lot of people to get to some of these truths that exist. So I like what you said when you're saying that these classical myths live on through modern day comic books, and mythology is a way that we're supposed, is a way to help view the world, right? And it's a different kind of truth. You have the truth of, the Richard Dawkins truth, straight up of science and materialism, and then we have the truth that we can understand through normal means, and that might be the truth of mythology, the truth of biblical stories, and in a generation that seems to reject religion, an organized religion, it's not like the need for that truth is gone. It's not like the need for understanding life through a moral perspective is gone. And comic books, and you hate to say, even though I do have a comic book on my shelf over there that's called Jesus 2, or it's called the Bible 2. Jesus comes back to kick some ass. It's a whole, my sister got it for me for it. It's hilarious. It's Jesus comes back. It's like the sequel, where he's here comes the second coming. But it's that idea, though, that we need to look at these things through a story perspective, because if we look at them through a historical perspective, it's different than looking at it through the lens of fiction. And I think that's what you were getting at, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
That idea that, okay, Thor exists as he's not somebody, that we're sacrificing a pig to or anything like that this week, but he still exists as a character in our collective imagination now, even though he looks like Chris Hemsworth, and he obviously takes human growth hormone. So, okay, so that's awesome. I love the idea of comic books and everything like that. And so Leslie Kean, man, I love Leslie Kean's work, and her work in this. When you're talking about scientific evidence for the survival of consciousness post-death, I feel like no one's done better work on that in the past 20 years than Leslie Kean. And so how was that interview, and did you come into that with any, when you were prepping for that interview, what were the questions you had in advance, and then what was the stuff that you were like, oh shit, I got to redo my questions because she had something new for me?
So I met Leslie last November. So she was in Houston speaking at Rice University. A friend of mine, Professor Jeffrey Kreipel, who's also an author, and he's really into this stuff. He's a genius. I respect him so much. He invited me to go watch her speak, and she was doing. I didn't go to her UFO seminar. I went to her surviving death one, and the evidence she presented there, is based on stuff in her book. I thought was really compelling and interesting, because generally in the past I would dismiss that kind of stuff as being, oh, that can't be real. But you look at her background as a legit investigative journalist at the New York Times, and she's willing to put her reputation on the line, not just for UFOs, but for this, which is even to some weirder than UFOs. So I think just her wanting to write a book about this really endorses the potential legitimacy, and some of the stuff that she's seen is truly like stranger than fiction. But she's also very careful and meticulous with her answers and how she does interviews. So I remember, there's some questions she couldn't answer, and she was really cool and respectful about that too. But I really think the research she's done, with UFOs and now surviving death, I think it's one of the best places to go from a legitimate source from her. I think she does an amazing job on everything she's done, especially her first book on UFOs, which. Many people don't realize she wasn't just getting U.S. intelligence officials on record. She was getting military and intelligence officials from all around the world to kind of speak on record about UFOs. And now she's kind of taking that. And, it's her growth from UFOs to, life after death and consciousness. I mean, that's a gradual thing that many people in the UFO world are doing right now anyway. So I think she's kind of a trailblazer in that sense.
And it's funny, right, that this metaphysics, this idea that we're talking about things that we like. One thing we love to talk about and see on the other side, obviously, is the big questions, right? Because the big questions are fun to talk about. We always joke it's the dorm room conversations. We get to have these even though Wendy and I are 25 years past the dorm room or whatever, or.
Same.
Right. We first started having these conversations even before we were playing in a band together.
Was talking about Art Bell.
Was talking about Art Bell and UFOs and having fun and being able to still do this a long time later. These are the angel. How many angels can dance upon the head of a pin conversation, but different than those conversations that they had 1,000 years ago. We now have scientific things we can add in there. And that's where like Leslie Kean becomes interesting, because that's going to the research. That's where Dean Radin is super interesting. Like going into there's now we can find, even though the numbers don't necessarily
overwhelm.
Right. They're not overwhelming numbers. It's just slightly beating chance. Like, you're like, okay, well, we're slightly beating chance in the statistics of psychic phenomenon, or we're finding things in the evidence of the survival of consciousness that are beyond it. And it's funny how like everything starts metaphysical, because thousands of years ago they had no science was just forming, and you had to just guess on everything. And so that everything was metaphysical. And then you get the very physical after the Enlightenment, where we can only talk about things we can prove. And now we're going back to the metaphysical. It's that weird cycle of we're finding evidence of things that we can't necessarily prove, but they still seem to have some kind of true resonance within us. Now, as a journalist, and you're somebody that studied journalism, Mike, you teach journalism. How do you? Okay, you think of a regular journalist working at the local paper, and he's the guy that does kind of weird stories sometimes. How do you approach a paranormal story versus you're approaching like a crime story? Like when you're doing this kind of research and writing, how are you approaching it differently? Or what is your J school instinct kind of like? Where does it lead you?
Well, you always want to try to present both sides of the story. Any good news story, you want to be accurate and fair. It's hard if you're interviewing somebody who saw something, right? It's really hard to get the other side of that. It's always good to bring a different voice to maybe theorize what it could have been in the sky or what they could have saw for sure. But a lot of these stories are usually just witness testimony, so in a sense, it's not like it's not one-sided, but usually, you have, one or two people who saw the same thing. So it's kind of hard to get the other side of the argument in that sense. But like when you're doing like a bigger story, like for example, one of the newer New York Times stories that Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie did, they obviously had Ryan Graves, who witnessed the Tic Tac UFO. They had his quotes, but they also had, for balance, they had, I forgot who he was. He was just some professor who gave a really bad take on what these UFOs could be. But you kind of need those in a story, and especially in a mainstream outlet like that, for balance. So you approach these stories the same. You try to get as many sides as possible, but sometimes it's harder because there's only maybe a few witnesses or expertise to go around.
But what I love what you're talking about, though, is you're talking about balance. And like the thing is that in order for people write journalism in order to make people feel that they're getting both sides, that they're getting a full picture. And so I think especially in this kind of world where we're talking about the metaphysical or the wild, like, oh, we're talking about UFOs, we're talking about Bigfoot, we're talking about seeing ghosts, man. Like, we need to present, okay, here are the people that saw the ghosts. And here's the other things they might have seen that aren't ghosts. So you can give a balanced perspective, and then people can feel good that they're reading something that isn't trying to deliver a narrative to them. And
that's... Oh, sorry.
No, please. This is what I would like. So when you're writing something like this as a journalist, versus maybe your second book revealed your true colors with True Believers or whatever. But when you're trying to talk about this, though, you want to deliver it in a way that helps people believe that you're giving them that balanced perspective to make it the most interesting. And so please continue from what you were about to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in Stranger Than Fiction specifically, the Skinwalker, the area in the book where I talk about Skinwalker Ranch, so there's a lot of different sides that are presented. There is the kind of quote unquote threat aspect where Skinwalker Ranch is a scary place, it's dangerous potentially. Then I present some people like Eric Lukes and Chris Bartell who say the other side that it's really a sacred place. And then there's also the kind of in the middle where I talked to Brandon Fugel, the owner, and Travis Taylor, one of the scientists, who are like, hey, we're just trying to figure out what this place is. We're not choosing a good or evil side. We just know that there's these anomalies here, and we're gonna try to get to the bottom of what it is, and we're gonna try to actually do real scientific studies to try to just get a better understanding of what this place is, for sure.
And so so punk rock and UFOs, like you've been around at least 3 or 4 years now. So as far as the blog or whatever, like what's your, how long have you been around? Like, 'cause the thing is, in the paranormal world, things start, things stop,
Yeah.
But now I feel like punk rock and UFOs has been around for 4 years, 5 years?
At least, like, I think as soon as the first book came out, I started the website after that because I wasn't sure if I was going to have the opportunity to write another book. So I was like, I'd really like to keep up this research, especially through the website. And the idea of writing a third book, I was actually just going through some of my articles, and I'm like, wow, I have a lot of stuff. If I was to potentially write another book that I could pull from, as well as obviously adding a lot more, new material, new research too. So, I think the website serves a good purpose for me because I always like to write and, do these types of stories, and I just like writing in general. For me, like I do I used to work full time with Eastern Chronicle, and I don't anymore, but I still do like this little side blog for them. So between that and punk rock and UFOs, I really get my journalism fix.
Sure. And specifically, when I think about the pop culture aspect, and maybe even the band and the rock and roll aspect, which Wendy and I have not been able to indulge in because we haven't been able to go play shows with other bands for 3 months. But when you talk to, obviously entertainment people in the entertainment field, and you're talking about the different bands you've interviewed and people you talk to, have you found that there's a difference between the people that are into UFOs, ghosts, paranormal by genre? Do you think like, oh man, country artists don't got it, rocker artists they got it, EDM artists they've seen God on mushrooms? Like, what's have you noticed by genre any difference in bands or musicians or artists that believe?
That's a good question because it's like you see a lot of like metal and like a lot of punk rock bands who write songs about aliens and UFOs and ghosts, but you also see like some hip hop songs too. Like Nas has a song, I forgot the name of it. I think I mentioned it in the playlist I put for my first book. I forgot what it's called, but the whole thing is basically it's about aliens, but it's like when you listen to the lyrics, you're like, oh, he knows his stuff. It's not just saying, oh, aliens are real and exist. So it's cool to see it, on different genres of music. I think, you really can't pinpoint saying one genre believes more than another, because I'm pretty sure there's country artists who've seen things, and there's pop stars. I think Rihanna says something that she believes in UFOs, and she's seen UFOs too. So I think it's really cross genre.
Right. Well, like you're talking about hip hop. We were discussing on text, I believe, when Charlemagne the God's autobiography came out. Like his first thing in the autobiography was like, "Oh yeah, I believe in ghosts because my toys used to just turn on in the middle of the night, and I was trying to get him for an interview or whatever, and he was all into it. And then he probably just saw my Twitter feed, and he was like, "Okay, you're not popular enough for me to sell the book," but." The thing is, Charlemagne the God at the time, like he did that interview with Joe Biden a month ago.
Yeah.
That was all over the news. And when
Right.
Joe Biden said, like, you ain't black, like vote for me or whatever, like that was Charlemagne the God. Like Charlemagne the God's a believer when it comes to spirits, the other side, like the whole thing. And it's interesting, I think, when you think of like, that's awesome that like hip hop has that element, and he's a very influential figure as a radio DJ in that world. And you compare it to death metal, and death metal seems like very, even though they'll sing about some of these dark themes, they're all from a very atheist perspective of that's why I'm so mad about everything, because there is no God and life sucks. And so like the genre thing is interesting too, because you have that entire genre of music called soul. Right, soul coming from the songs in church and everything like that, but that has to come from some kind of Holy Spirit in there. And so the way that art interprets the paranormal and comes through is always something interesting to talk about and discuss, because that's part of our it's part of understanding where the culture comes from, and learning a little bit like of that belief system helps you appreciate the music a little more, I think. And I think that's what's fun in books like yours, Mike, because you're coming from that perspective of punk rock, which always had a very political message, whether it's going to be anarchy in the Sex Pistols sense, or socialism in the Bad Religion sense, and things like that all put together, but also looking at where the beliefs come from is a way that we can analyze the culture that we enjoy. I'm sure there's a ton of people that love Bad Religion, or that still go to church, and they wear the t-shirt and the t-shirt with the it's the t-shirt with the cross. That's the Ghostbusters symbol through the cross. And you see that, but also at the same thing is like you analyzing that culture critically, as well as appreciating how it sets a fire in us, is really cool. And so that's exciting. So in this latest book, and looking through the pop culture, Mike, is there anything in particular that you found, or any new punk songs, any new rock songs, any new songs in general about the paranormal that maybe you hadn't been turned on to before, that you heard and you can't wait for people to read the book and maybe like, now check out this song?
So I didn't do that in this book. I didn't put like a playlist like I did the previous ones.
Okay.
But like for example, there's I wanted to do a story on a band called the Menzingers because they did a video. It's called America's Freaking Me Out, and the video basically has an alien. It's actually the makeup and like the special effects on it are great for a music video. And it's basically like an alien coming to Earth in America, realizing how much of a messed up place it is. So I think it was a perfect video. The management was like, I'm sorry, the publicity was down. The management kind of passed on it, but in general, though, this book is more about. I really didn't incorporate too much music because it's really not about that. I know in past books I like to kind of associate it with, I put playlists at the end. And there's actually some quotes from songs used in this book just to kind of start out chapters. But one of the things I want to touch on that you said earlier about how kind of like this artistic mindset. One of the things I really appreciate what you guys do. I think it's really rad that you guys write these songs. They're almost like personalized per episode. I think that's so cool to actually write a song that's not based about something that necessarily you've done or happened to you personally, but write it from a different perspective. I think it's really cool how you guys do that with some of the episodes, how you have a song for that episode based off something paranormal. So I think that's really cool. I think that sets you guys apart for sure.
Thank you.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
But like when you were saying, like pop culture reveals a truth about us that may not be necessarily scientific, but there's truth in art, and I think we all find that. And so, like I know that Wendy and I believe in all these guys and you and people who are creating books and writing about this and talking to experiencers. There's truth there. That we hope to find and kind of channel it through song, in a way.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think art is a way of expressing, especially with paranormal themes. It's a way of expressing and dealing with it in a way that you can't with words, And these topics, a lot of times words fail you. So art is a great way to share that, and you can see, throughout history, you can see. Through the pop culture and whatnot, you can see things that aren't necessarily in the history books. I don't know.
And music's just another great medium of learning anything, for that matter. I mean, growing up as a kid, I learned so much from listening to like Dead Kennedys and like Bad Religion and like Dead Prez, like a hip hop band that I wouldn't have previously maybe not known on my own. So.
Mm-hmm. For
awesome.
Sure.
Okay, so people that want to buy Punk Rock and UFOs, Stranger Than Fiction, Mike Damante's third book, where can they get that on June 16th?
June 16th will be on Amazon and Barnes & Noble's websites. So
awesome.
Fantastic.
It'll be on print and obviously digital formats too.
Okay.
Great.
So make sure
Congrats on the book.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate it. This is definitely my best work for sure. And I think if people say, "Oh, you wrote some other books too," I'm like, "Just read this one. Trust me."
I'm excited. I can't wait to read it.
Fantastic. So
awesome.
You guys, make sure you check that out. Make sure to follow Mike at punkrockandufos.com because he has paranormal stuff coming up every once in a while, and it's really it's good blog posts, always interesting interviews, and things that you'll enjoy. It's in my Feedly. And I hope that it's in your Feedly or whatever way, Apple News or whatever way you like to find it. So, Mike, any last words for the See Another Side audience?
No, just like once again, thank you guys for having me. I think this is one of my favorite shows to go on. I think you guys offer a really unique platform and perspective. So I appreciate all the support through the years and having me on again. And like I said, I think this book is going to be something that the average person can read and learn a little bit of something about. Stuff that we already know is going on, in the high strangeness world, but also kind of connect that to, some of the things that they have learned or they've seen. My goal is for some kid to watch a Marvel movie and say, oh, wait a minute, what Doctor Strange is doing, I've read about that in this book, or, this idea of, be able to astral project yourself. This is a real idea that, Marvel didn't just make this up. So that's definitely one of the goals in there for sure.
Cool.
Fantastic.
Very cool.
Well, obviously, we encourage all you guys to go to punkrockandufos.com to check out Mike's new book. And to explore what's out there. A man after our own heart who finds the
that's our
paranormal
favorite topic.
in the pop culture. It's fantastic. So, Mike, once again, thank you for joining us. Everybody else out there, we will see you on the other side.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.